Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the Dalton Gang of the 1890s. They operated in Kansas, Oklahoma, and a lot of territory around those areas. And they had a bank robbery that was pretty crazy, but they also had some other robberies, and there is potentially still some loot buried from their days as outlaws. So this story starts out, we're going to talk about the bank robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas. So about 9:30 in the morning in Coffeyville, Kansas on October 6th of 1892, five men rode into town. And these men wore false mustaches and false sideburns, and they were obviously trying to disguise their identity, but at this point no one really seemed to notice or care. So they tied their horses to a fence at 8th Street and Maple, and three men went into the Condon's Bank, and two ran across the street and ran into the First National Bank at the same time. So while inside both of the banks, these men proceeded to rob both of these banks at the exact same time. So finally someone on the street realized what was going on and yelled out that the banks were being robbed. And inside the Condon Bank, the three outlaws were told that they had to wait a few more minutes for the time lock to release on the safe at 9:45. So as they waited, citizens were gathering outside, and some of them had enough time to arm themselves. While across the street, Bob and Emmett Dalton, they had a little bit better luck at the First National Bank, and they had gathered thousands of dollars into their bags, and as they tried to exit the bank, shots rung out from the street. So they ducked back into the bank. And they took hostages as shields, and they ducked out the back door as the shooting was mainly concentrated out front in the plaza area. So with that 9:45 a.m. safe unlocking still a couple of minutes away, the citizens outside basically shot out the windows of the Condon Bank, and a shootout ensued. So the bank employees and the Condon Bank, they hit the floor, and the bandits in this bank, which were three bandits of the Dalton Gang, it was Bill Power, Grat Dalton, and Richard Broadwell. They shot it out with the citizens on the street. So now escape was their main focus. The safe wasn't unlocking yet, they didn't have access to the money, and now they just needed to escape. So they ran out into the street to continue the shootout and try to escape. So Bob and Emmett Dalton, who had come out of the First National Bank, they had better luck with their escape, and they had $21,000 in loot in their bags. So Bob did manage to kill three men while they disappeared from the plaza after crossing the street and disappearing behind the Condon's Bank. So they met up there with their gang member friends at a junction in the alley, and they had just a few feet to get to their horses. But by now, many more armed citizens had entered the alley and were chasing the bandits. And a bunch more armed citizens showed up because the hardware store across the street had armed a posse of men in seconds, and the bandits were going to have a heck of a time now trying to escape. So the gunfight in the alley was furious as the Dalton Gang tried to get to their horses, Many citizens knew that Bob Dalton had taken down 3 of their friends and neighbors already, and so they were determined to take him down, and they did so fairly quickly. Next, Grat Dalton was hit, but he propped himself up and he kept firing, and he took out Marshall Connolly. The 47-year-old Marshall died right there. As Grat tried to crawl away towards the horses, a bullet from a citizen's gun had ended his life. So Emmett Dalton was also hit numerous times, but he still managed to get to his horse with his bags of money. And gang member Bill Powers, aka Tom Evans, was also dead. It seemed that Richard Broadwell had escaped, and Richard also had aliases of John Moore and Texas Jack. So the townspeople followed his trail and found he had fallen from his horse dead about a half a mile away. So Emmett Dalton, who I mentioned was wounded a few times, he managed to be captured before he could escape with his sack of $21,000, and that money was returned to the bank with only $20 missing. So Emmett managed to survive, and he was the only one that managed to survive, and he was sent to prison for quite a few years. But this isn't all of the story. And I mean, it's a crazy story that they tried to rob 2 banks at the same time, and as luck or the lack of luck on their side would have it, the hardware store armed a lot of citizens, or they might have been able to get away. But although it was the end of the line for 4 out of the 5 gang members, there was a lot that occurred before the holdup in Coffeyville, Kansas. So what a lot of people in Coffeyville didn't know was that the evening before the robbery, the gang had buried their loot from a couple recent robberies nearby their campsite. And this was a campsite just south of Coffeyville, Kansas. And this is where they made camp to plan their robbery of the Coffeyville banks. So this cash was believed to be worth around $10,000 to $20,000 in 1892. So before the Coffeyville bank robberies, the Dalton Gang held up a train near Wagoner, Oklahoma Territory, and another train near Adair, Oklahoma Territory. And a few weeks later, they robbed a bank in El Reno, Oklahoma Territory. So the El Reno robbery netted them around $17,000, and the train robberies around $10,000. So they ended up using some of the loot to resupply themselves with new clothes and new saddles and, for the horses and other new goods. And the rest of the money, I believe Emmett had said later on, they had packed in their saddlebags. And on the evening of October 5th of 1892, the gang arrived at the junction where Onion Creek joins the Verdigris River near the Oklahoma-Kansas border, and they set up camp. So I don't know, it doesn't say if it was right at the junction or just a little ways from the junction of the creek with the river. So they unsaddled their horses, they unloaded all their goods, including all their ill-gotten gains, and the remaining gold and silver coins were buried in a shallow hole that they dug near their campfire. And the next morning they ate breakfast and they proceeded to Coffeyville for the bank robberies. And if they had gotten separated, they were to rendezvous at this campsite where they would then retrieve the buried money and escape with their newly acquired bank funds from Coffeyville. But all didn't go as planned, as you already know, and only Emmett survived, and he received a 15-year prison sentence, and he ended up being paroled in 1907. So when he had told the story about Onion Creek and the campsite and them planning the Coffeyville robbery and everything there, others had looked for this campsite, and it had never been found. So upon his release, he was watched and followed for weeks, and he never returned to Onion Creek or anywhere near that area. So he had been interviewed a ways later, and at one point he reported that he felt that the money was cursed and that he wanted nothing to do with it at that point. And that seemed to maybe be the case because they never saw him going back around that area to look for it. So the precise location of the Onion Creek campsite has been basically debated a lot for many years, and apparently the course of the creek has changed a bit too, so it has been difficult for anyone to locate the exact correct area. But many years later, Mary Brown, she heard the story of the Dalton Gang camping out on Onion Creek up to the morning of the bank robbery, and she finally put two and two together. So she was the daughter of a nearby rancher, and she remembered on the morning of the Coffeyville bank robbery and that shootout that she remembered a situation that she encountered that morning near Onion Creek. And she was riding her horse on a road near Onion Creek, and she heard voices near the creek as she's kind of trotting along slowly, and it sounded like some men were eating and saddling up their horses, according to some of the voices and things she heard. And she said a few minutes later, she was startled by 5 horsemen racing out from under an Onion Creek bridge right in front of her. So it was many years later when she had this recollection that came back to her, and she decided to go back to this area and try to locate this exact spot that this occurred. So I don't know if she remembered it because of just being startled by these men racing out of there, or if they looked funny in disguises and so she made mental note of it. But anyhow, nonetheless, she did remember this encounter many years later, and I'm sure the news of the shootout in Coffeyville traveled fast later that day, and so it may have been in her mind that this was also another funny thing that happened that same day. So as she went back to look in that general area, she discovered that the old bridge must have been torn down, as it no longer existed where she remembered it. She also noticed that parts of the creek were not the same as she remembered, and it seemed to have shifted course a bit since she was there last. And she found that she was unable to locate the old campsite. It was not located by anyone up to that point either that knew some of the story from Emmett. And it's believed that there could still be buried loot in the area somewhere near Onion Creek, near the Kansas-Oklahoma border, at some point fairly near where Onion Creek dumps into the Verdigris River. So that is the story of the Coffeyville, Kansas shootout by the Dalton Gang and the burial of their prior loot that may still be out there.